Hello there. I'm Dr. Blunt, author, philosopher, man about town. This is my YouTube channel, and we're going to be talking about the content and structure of the right of resistance. Now, the right of resistance used to be, about 250 years ago, a core topic in political philosophy. But since then, it has really sort of disappeared to the fringes. Marxists tend to write about resistance. Post-colonial scholars write about resistance. But people who focus on rights, especially human rights, tended to avoid it as a topic. And this has started to change a little bit over the past 10 years. You've got really great philosophers, people like Christopher Finley and Simon Caney writing about the right to resistance now, but they take a traditional analytic approach to it. They're interested in the Hofeldian structure of rights. Is it a claim right? Is it a liberty right? Now, in my book, this isn't what I do. Rather than sort of looking at an abstract structural construct for the right of resistance, I chose to look first at the practice of resistance. I looked at a test case, slavery. So why slavery? Well, I've got a couple of reasons. The first is the analytic approach tends to be the province of philosophers and lawyers. And I'm really interested in the agency of people who actually have experienced forms of severe oppression. So slavery is a natural test case for that. The other thing is that I work in the Republican tradition of political thought. Think Cicero rather than Trump. And this is a way of bridging their interest in slavery and freedom with my interest in human rights. And the final thing is that slavery had this really interesting historiographic revolution in the 1970s that I think is needed in political philosophy, at least in global distributive justice, now. So prior to the 1970s, people thought of slavery in basically two ways in history. One was that it was sort of not so bad, right? These were apologists for the Confederacy. They thought that, before the war, slavery, it was sort of okay, right? People might have been enslaved, but it was a ordered patriarchal society where everyone had a place and there was a place for everyone, and it was less exploitative than, free labor up in the factories in the North. Now, obviously this is bullshit, right? Like, I'm not going to pull your leg. These are people who are interested in defending oppression. But it flipped, right? There was the other side that was just like, oh no, it wasn't this benevolent patriarchy. It was, in fact, like a concentration camp writ large. It was brutal. It was oppressive. It destroyed the agency of the people who lived in it. But the problem with this is that agency doesn't get destroyed that easily. Slaves still lived lives. They weren't automaton completely destroyed by the system. And there was this revolution in the history of slavery where people started asking what slaves did. How did they resist? What was an average day in a slave's life like? And I find that really, really interesting. So in the book, I look at three test cases. One is the Haitian Revolution, the other is Fugitive Slaves, and the last one is just day-to-day resistance. So let's look at them. Let's start with the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution I find really interesting. I mean, I would do an entire series on it if I was a historian. And, I came very close to being a historian. I was choosing between philosophy and history, and I decided that philosophy was more marketable. What can I say? I was a stupid kid. Still wearing my track pants, too. Drip up top, relax on the bottom. Okay, I'm not going to give you a deep dive into the Haitian Revolution. I'm going to give you a real quick rundown. So in the late 18th century, the people of Haiti, the enslaved people of Haiti, rose up in rebellion. They were fighting the French Empire. They wanted to abolish slavery and create something independent. And under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture especially, they did just that. The Haitian Revolution is the only example in human history of slaves casting off their masters and making their own state. Now, that's not to romanticize it. The Haitian Revolution was bloody. It produced a free state, but one that was isolated from the international system, that was economically devastated, and that was kept basically under a cordon sanitaire for decades afterwards for fear of anti-slave rebellions emerging throughout the Caribbean. But one thing it did achieve was the abolition of slavery on the island. Now, what does this tell us about resistance to slavery? Well, this captures a lot of our intuitions about it, right? It is organized, it is political, it is overt, it is violent. It has all of these sort of intuitive characteristics that we associate with slave revolutions. But it's not the whole story of slave resistance, is it? Resistance to slavery was often more subtle because slavery was incredibly strong as an institution. The only reason why Toussaint Louverture succeeded where Spartacus failed is that the French Revolution weakened the French Empire. So what did other slaves do? Well, the first example I look at is fugitive slaves. Slaves who run away from their owners, who run away from the plantation. These are people like Frederick Douglass, the great American orator, philosopher, and politician. He escaped slavery, and hundreds of thousands of other people did this as well. It was a way of saying, I find this system unendurable, I can't destroy it, so I'm going to run away from it. And this wasn't without risk, right? If you got caught by a slave patrol, you could expect to be beaten by your master, you might even be killed, you might even be sold down the river. Yeah, that's where that turn of phrase comes from. It is when you get sold to the most brutal and exploitative plantations in the Deep South, where they would probably work you to death. So getting sold down the river had an actual tangible meaning, was something people were deeply afraid of. Okay, the point I'm driving at is that the risks associated with becoming a fugitive slave were so high that many people felt that it was unreasonable, so they didn't attempt to escape from their conditions. But this doesn't mean that they were simply passive subjects waiting for someone else to liberate them. They subtly undermined the system of slavery through what gets called day-to-day resistance. Stealing from the kitchen, going to illegal church services, marrying someone who their owner didn't approve of. These were the everyday sort of yous that slaves could say in coded language and coded action to their owners. And this is a form of resistance as well. So we get this broad spectrum of what resistance actually constitutes. And what does that tell us about how resistance to slavery operates? And what does that tell us in general about the right to resistance? Well, the first thing I'll say is that it shows us that there are two strains of resistance, right? On one hand, you have this sort of classic form of resistance, this justice-seeking resistance that you find in the works of Caney and the works of Finlay. This idea that the right of resistance is about overthrowing oppressive systems and establishing something better. It is a claim towards creating something new, to be free from oppression. But there's another side of it as well, right? And that's injustice evading forms of resistance, like the runaway slaves, like the day-to-day resistance. Okay, so look, I think that there might be some of you who are sort of skeptical, right, about whether things like fugitive slaves or everyday resistance is actually resistance. Because we have this idea in our mind about resistance. It should be big, it should be dramatic. We think of orators in halls giving speeches. We think of people applauding. We think of action spilling out into the streets. We think of lists of demands. We think of governments overthrown and new states established. It's really powerful, but it's not the whole story, right? Because that sort of resistance requires a degree of power already. Many people who live in extremely oppressive conditions just don't have that sort of power. You can't sort of go around being like, this sucks, because you'll wind up with a bullet in the back of your head. You need to resist in subtler ways, in a way that James C. Scott calls infrapolitical. So what Scott drives at when he's talking about infrapolitics is comparable to infrared light. There is this spectrum of light that our eyes can't see without assistance. And in politics, there's often a politics that's outside of our ordinary visual spectrum. And that's the sort of injustice evading resistance that I'm interested in. And it has a powerful impact, right? So one person running away from slavery doesn't make a big difference. Neither does 10. Neither does 100. But what about 1,000? What about 100,000? What about more than that? So when Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation, about 600,000 slaves had crossed into Union territory. Lincoln was recognizing what was already a fait accompli. The slaves had already freed themselves. Likewise, with everyday resistance, it seems meaningless, but it was a way of putting people on notice, right? That sort of chicken going missing. that person getting married, those religious services being observed. These were ways to upset the ruling class because they couldn't pretend that they lived in this patriarchal utopia where everyone was well looked after when the slaves were always subtly needling them. It helped them to express their discontent in a way that couldn't really be punished unless you were sort of caught with the chicken in hand, but that kept the ruling class on notice. And that, I think, is extremely important. Okay, quickly wrapping it up. When we think about the content and structure of the right to resistance, we need to bear in mind that justice-seeking and injustice-evading component of resistance, of that content, because it tells us about the structure. We have this positive claim right, which is the right to live in a system, whether it's international or domestic, in which one's core human rights can be protected. But then there's that evasion part, that liberty right, which is also the right to escape oppression, the right to be free of it. You might not be building something better, but you have the right to get away from injustice. And they blend together in a really interesting way that we're going to explore as we move forward into the topic of resistance and global poverty. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video, I hope. And thanks for everyone for watching. I mean, I didn't think anyone was going to watch these videos. It's cool. Thank you. Not just yelling into the void. I have at least 7 followers. Take care, everyone.